They said family comes first. But how would you feel if that meant your parents secretly planned to evict you from your own home for your sister's baby? I didn't confront them. I recorded everything, and when the night came, I showed them what family looked like on screen. My sister's lie shattered, my parents' pride collapsed, and the silence that followed. That was justice. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe /like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Rain whispered against the windows of my 12th floor apartment in Queen Anne, as Seattle settled into its usual gray rhythm. I'd just finished my last telehealth session of the day, my patient still lingering in my mind, when I poured myself a glass of Cabernet and sank into the couch. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned after a long week. Then my phone buzzed. A notification from my home security app blinked across the screen. Motion detected. Living room. I frowned. I'd installed the new smart cameras 2 weeks ago after a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood. They were discreet, small black domes tucked in corners synced to my phone. I hadn't expected to need them, especially not tonight. I tapped the alert. The live feed loaded, and for a moment my brain refused to process what I was seeing. My father, Edward Mitchell, 64, still broad-shouldered in his tailored overcoat, was standing in my living room. My mother, Olivia, followed close behind, her hair perfectly sprayed, as if she'd walked out of Sunday service. And there, settling herself onto my couch, was my younger sister, Rachel, 28, 7 months pregnant. One hand on her belly, the other already reaching for the remote, like she owned the place. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Mom's voice came through the speakers, sweet and casual. "If Rachel stays here, she'll be safe. It's quiet. It's close to the hospital." Dad's reply was low, practical. "Lauren won't have the heart to throw her out. She's too soft for that." Rachel giggled, rubbing her stomach. "This place is perfect. So much better than that one-bedroom Mark and I were looking at." My hand tightened around the wine glass. "You've got to be kidding me," I whispered to no one. Dad paced to the wall near my office door, holding a tape measure. "The crib can go here," he said. "Plenty of space." Mom opened the closet by the entryway, my closet, and started flipping through my coats. "These can go into storage," she said lightly, tossing one onto the couch beside Rachel. I froze the frame. My chest felt hollow. For a long moment, I just stared at the still image, my family comfortable in my home discussing how to repurpose my life. Then, like an echo through time, another scene surfaced in my memory. A year ago, the day I discovered my grandmother's pearl necklace missing from my dresser, the one heirloom she'd left specifically to me. I'd asked my mother about it. She'd brushed me off, said maybe I misplaced it. A month later, I saw the same necklace gleaming around Rachel's neck in a photo from her baby shower. My jaw clenched. I hit play again. They were still there, moving around like a team of decorators. Dad taking notes, Mom humming, Rachel talking about color palettes. I felt the heat of anger rise, but beneath it a strange, detached calm. The kind that comes before a difficult diagnosis or a patient's confession. The kind of calm I'd practiced for years listening to people rationalize cruelty in therapy sessions. Except this time it was my own family on the couch. "They used my key," I murmured. "My spare key, given to them years ago for emergencies." I'd never imagined the emergency would be my own boundaries. I took a slow breath, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. The red light of the camera blinked in the corner of the feed, reflected faintly in my eyes on the phone screen. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sound of rain fill the silence. Through the speaker, Rachel said, "I'll set up my home office in that spare room." What does Lauren even use it for? Anyway. Mom answered without hesitation. "That's her therapy room, but she can see clients online from anywhere. She'll understand." I laughed. Short, sharp, humorless. "Oh, she'll understand," I said softly. I reached for my laptop and plugged in the external hard drive, the one I used for patient files and encrypted case notes. I downloaded the footage, labeled it clearly. Evidence 1. Old habits die hard. Documentation always comes first. When the transfer completed, I set the laptop aside and stared out the window. The city lights shimmered on the slick streets below. The Space Needle glowed faintly through the fog. They were probably still there, rearranging my life one piece of furniture at a time. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My parents are redecorating my apartment without permission. No, that would come later, when it mattered. For now, I just needed to watch, to see how far they'd go. I turned back to the screen. Dad had sat down now, rubbing his back, while Mom scrolled through her phone. Rachel was texting someone, probably Mark, about how convenient this would be. I whispered almost tenderly. You think I'm too soft. You think I won't fight back. You have no idea who you raised. The rain picked up, streaking down the glass. My own reflection hovered over their images, ghost-like, detached. Voiceover. I used to think security cameras were meant to protect you from strangers, but sometimes the stranger breaking in carries your last name. I saved another copy of the file to the cloud, backed it up twice, and closed the laptop. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the air thicker. I finished my wine in one long sip, then set the glass down carefully on the counter. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the bay. Inside, I whispered to the dark. They've made their move, but they've forgotten something. A pause. The red light on the camera blinked once more. I know how to watch too. The rain softened, and the city fell silent again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt awake. The next morning, the rain had eased into a mist that hung over the streets like steam. Seattle always felt half awake at this hour. Quiet, gray, familiar. I walked the 12 blocks to Cascade Behavioral Health. My clinic, the soles of my boots slick on the wet pavement. The air smelled of coffee and cedar. I told myself the walk would clear my head, but all it did was make room for the memories I'd been trying not to touch. When I was 10, my birthday party was canceled because Rachel caught a fever. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table, wearing the paper crown my friend had made me, while my mother called every guest to tell them not to come. We'll reschedule, she'd said, her tone already distracted eyes on the thermometer. We never did. At 17, I'd received a scholarship to the University of Washington, 4 years full tuition. My father didn't even look up from the newspaper when I told him. Good for you, he said. But you'll come home on weekends, right? Your mother needs help with Rachel's recitals. I can't remember a single time either of them hugged me without reason, but I can recall dozens of photos of them hugging Rachel. The golden child, the miracle baby, the one who could do no wrong. I reached the clinic's front door, fished out my keys, and let myself in. The scent of eucalyptus diffusers greeted me. My receptionist, Tessa, smiled politely, unaware that I'd spent the night watching my family invade my apartment through a phone screen. Morning, Dr. Mitchell, she said. Your first patient's early. Send her in. I replied, setting my coffee down and forcing the professional calm that years of practice had perfected. The patient was a woman in her 50s named Carol, newly divorced, struggling to care for her elderly parents. Today she spoke about her brother. He's the favorite, she said, twisting a tissue in her hands. They gave him the house, the car. I get to be the responsible one. Her words hit harder than usual. I said softly, sometimes the responsible one becomes invisible. People assume you're fine because you always are. Carol looked up, eyes glassy. How did you know? Because I am you. I thought. Instead, I smiled. It's a pattern I've seen before. After the session, I closed my notebook, stared out at the drizzle beyond the glass, and whispered under my breath. Some of us are trained to stay calm, but no one ever teaches us what to do with the anger that comes later. By the time I left the clinic that evening, the streets were dark, again, glistening with reflected light. I drove home with the wipers on low, listening to the faint hum of jazz on the radio. My apartment building loomed against the skyline, modern, sterile, safe. Or so I'd thought. When I stepped inside, I didn't turn on the lights right away. The silence pressed against me like something alive. I slipped off my coat, set my bag down, and reached for my phone. A new text lit up the screen. From Rachel. Hey sis, the baby's coming soon, and Mark and I are in a tough spot. Could we stay at your place for a bit? Just until things settle down? You've got that extra room, right? I stared at the words, the smiley face she'd added at the end. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration dressed as one. I didn't reply. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, then dropped to the side of the phone. The app for my cameras blinked again. I opened it, more from instinct than curiosity. The feed showed my mother walking into my apartment earlier that afternoon. She had a tote bag over her arm and a measuring tape in hand. She was alone this time. She moved slowly, almost methodically, measuring the wall where my bookshelf stood, jotting notes on a yellow pad. She stopped by the window, gazing out at the same view I was staring at now, then smiled, faintly satisfied. I laughed under my breath, a short sound that cracked halfway through. My eyes burned before I realized I was crying. I whispered to the empty room. I teach people how to stay calm for a living. But no one ever taught me how to stay calm when it's my own family setting fire to my life. I walked to my bedroom, opened the top drawer of my nightstand, and pulled out an old leather album. The edges were worn soft. Inside were photos from decades of family occasions, birthdays, graduations, holidays that blurred together. I flipped to the one I'd avoided for years. Rachel's college graduation in Spokane. In the picture, she stood in her cap and gown, radiant and center frame, Dad's arm wrapped around her shoulders, Mom's smile beaming. I was there too, half turned away at the edge of the frame, cropped at the jawline. My own graduation photo hadn't made it into this album. That day, they'd missed it entirely because Rachel had a midterm. My thumb traced the corner of the photo. I remembered the exact moment I realized love in our house wasn't unconditional. It was a currency, and Rachel had the monopoly. Outside car lights slid across the wet pavement. The reflection of the city danced on my window, fractured and pale. I sat on the edge of my bed album, still open, feeling the weight of years I'd tried to rationalize away. I'd spent my entire adult life helping people make sense of betrayal, teaching them that forgiveness was freedom. But tonight, forgiveness felt like another form of denial. I thought of the footage again. The way my mother had opened my closet, without hesitation, the casual entitlement in her voice. It wasn't just about the apartment. It never was. It was about control, about rewriting the rules of who got to exist comfortably and who had to make room. I closed the album, slid it back into the drawer, and stood for a moment by the window. Seattle's skyline shimmered through a thin layer of fog. The rain had started again, steady, relentless. I pressed my hand to the glass, watching the droplets merge and slide downward, my reflection blurred with the city behind it. I spoke quietly, more to the memory of my grandmother than to the night. You were the only one who ever saw me, weren't you? My chest ached, but the tears had stopped. I took one last look at the dark apartment, the clean lines, the muted tones, everything I'd built by myself, and let out a slow breath. For the first time I realized that success had never been what they wanted from me. They only valued it when it could be repurposed for Rachel's benefit, I whispered. I thought if I became everything they told me to, they'd finally be proud. Turns out they only ever saw me as spare space. The city lights flickered through the mist. I turned away, leaving the window glowing behind me, the room quiet except for the sound of rain against the glass. By morning, I'd made up my mind. There would be no confrontation, no emotional outburst, no screaming matches that could be twisted and replayed as proof of how ungrateful I was. I'd spent my entire career teaching people how to manage anger. Now it was my turn to practice what I preached. Every patient who'd ever sat across from me had heard me say, "It don't react when you're angry. Plan when you're calm." I opened my laptop and typed an email to the staff at Cascade Behavioral Health, scheduling an automatic reply that said I'd be at a conference in Portland for 3 days. I even went as far as registering for one, just to make it believable if my parents decided to snoop. Portland was close enough to make sense far enough that they'd think they had time. Once that was set, I spent the afternoon upgrading my home security system. 2 new cameras, one facing the hallway outside my door, another hidden in the bookshelf of my office. The system now synced directly to cloud storage. I copied all existing footage, encrypted it, and shared the link with Emily Carter, my best friend and lawyer. She'd been my classmate in college, and the one person who never doubted me. Her reply came 5 minutes later. Got it. Everything okay? I typed back. Just family stuff. Keep it safe for now. Her next message was simple. Always, by late afternoon, I needed to breathe. I walked down to a small cafe near the clinic, a place with chipped mugs and rain-fogged windows. I liked it because no one there knew me as Dr. Mitchell. I could just exist. The place was half empty except for a man at the corner table interviewing someone, a woman in her 30s, pale and tired-looking. The man had a recorder on the table and a notepad filled with cramped handwriting. When the interview ended, he thanked her and noticed me watching. He smiled slightly. Sorry if we were too loud. Not at all. I said, glancing at the recorder. Journalist guilty, he said. Ethan Miller. I'm writing a series about family betrayals, how people rebuild after being cut off. That word hung in the air between us. Cut off. He stirred his coffee. I want to write about people brave enough to say no to blood ties. Everyone talks about forgiveness, but not about survival. I smiled, maybe too tightly. If you ever find someone like that, let me know. I'd like to read it. He studied me for a moment, maybe sensing the irony. You look like someone who's seen both sides of it. Occupational hazard. I said, grabbing my cup. I'm a psychologist. He laughed. So you probably think journalists are the new therapists. Only the ones who listen. He grinned. Maybe I'll quote you on that. When I left, the sky had gone from silver to charcoal. I walked home, the sound of rain against my umbrella, steady and rhythmic, grounding me. Inside the apartment, the air was still untouched. Everything exactly where I'd left it that morning. I turned on the living room lights and opened the camera feed on my phone. The timestamp read 7:43 p.m. There was my mother again, walking through the door with my spare key. She carried a box and a large reusable bag. From inside, she pulled out a roll of masking tape, a notepad, and what looked like color swatches. My father followed behind her, measuring tape in hand. These can go into storage, Mom said, opening my closet and pulling out a jacket. That's fine, Dad replied. Rachel needs space for the baby gear. Rachel appeared a minute later, scrolling through her phone, talking about bassinets. Mark found one online that would fit perfectly here. My heartbeat quickened. My coffee sat forgotten on the counter. I sank into the armchair and turned the volume up. Their voices filled the room like a haunting. They weren't whispering. They weren't worried about being caught. It was all so casual. 3 people dismantling my life as if it were a shared project. I gripped the warm mug in my hands until my knuckles whitened. You don't even think of this as mine anymore, I murmured. The therapist in me tried to analyze it. Displacement, entitlement, familial enmeshment. But the daughter in me just wanted to scream. Instead, I inhaled deeply through my nose, exhaled slowly, and let the anger settle into focus. I pulled out my phone and pressed record. My own voice, calm and deliberate, filled the silence. This is Dr. Lauren Mitchell. For the record, I am documenting trespassing by my parents and sister into my private residence. No consent was given. The words steadied me. Cold clarity was the best anesthetic. I replayed their conversation one more time. Olivia's voice rang out clearly. Lauren's never home anyway. She'll understand once she sees how happy this makes Rachel. I closed my eyes and whispered, You've mistaken understanding for permission. By midnight, my suitcase sat by the door. I packed light. Just enough to make the lie believable. I double-checked every lock, every hidden camera angle, every timestamp. The apartment looked exactly the same as it had before. Orderly, serene. A perfect stage. Before I left, I stood in the doorway, hand on the light switch. My eyes fell on the brass nameplate beside the doorbell. L. Mitchell. The hallway lights flickered, casting a warm glow on the polished letters. I'm not leaving, I said softly to the empty hall. I'm watching. I turned off the lights, pulled the door shut, and rolled my suitcase toward the elevator. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, still expressionless, but alive with something deeper than anger. It wasn't rage. It was resolve. The kind that builds slowly, quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 3 days later, I came back to Seattle under the same heavy clouds I'd left behind. The drive up from Portland was long and quiet, the kind of silence that hums in your bones. I parked beneath my building and took the elevator up, the metallic scent of rain clinging to my coat. When I unlocked the door, everything was immaculate. Too immaculate. Every surface gleamed, every cushion perfectly aligned. Even the faint scent of lavender polish hung in the air. Nothing was out of place, but it didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt staged, like a model unit. I set my suitcase down and walked slowly through each room. My bookshelf had been reorganized. The rows looked too neat. The guest bedroom door was ajar, and the faint outline of painter's tape marked the wall. My desk had been wiped clean, my office chair pushed in. The perfection of it all felt invasive, surgical. I powered on my laptop and inserted the small silver USB drive. The folder labeled Hallway loaded first. I clicked play. The footage showed them. My father, Edward, standing by the door with a clipboard. My mother, Olivia, wearing a cardigan and that same expression of cheerful entitlement. And Rachel, her belly prominent under a pale blue dress. Let's do gray, my father said, pointing at the wall. It's neutral, good for a nursery. Maybe with a yellow accent, my mother suggested. Warm, but still classy. Rachel turned toward the camera, unknowingly looking straight into the lens. Mark will love it. We'll finally have space. My throat tightened. Space. I repeated softly. That was the word they always used, like I was a guest occupying a room they'd owned all along. I scrubbed through the video. At one point, my mother picked up my framed diploma from the University of Washington, looked at it for a moment, and said, "We should box these up. Too clinical for a baby's room. Too clinical." I let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. I sat back staring at the paused frame. I could almost hear my own heartbeat over the hum of the laptop. For years, I'd rationalized their favoritism, told myself it wasn't malicious. But watching them now, comfortable, methodical, confident, it was undeniable. They weren't taking advantage by accident. They were planning it. I opened my contacts and scrolled until I found Mark Reynolds, Rachel's fiancé. 31 finance degree, the kind of man who said, "We'll figure it out," when life started to unravel. We'd met twice. Once at Christmas, once at their engagement dinner. He'd been polite, maybe even kind, but naive. The call connected after 3 rings. His voice was groggy. "Lauren." "Everything okay?" "Hi, Mark. I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I was hoping we could meet for coffee. Somewhere public." A pause. "Public?" "Yes. Pike Place Market." "There's a small cafe near the bookshop. Tomorrow, around noon." He hesitated. "This about Rachel. It's about the truth," I said, and hung up before I could soften it. The next afternoon, the market was crowded despite the drizzle. Tourists huddled under umbrellas, vendors shouting over the smell of roasted coffee and salt air. I found a corner table by the window. Mark arrived 10 minutes late, looking exhausted, his shirt untucked beneath a rain jacket. "Thanks for meeting me," I said. He nodded. Sitting opposite me, "Rachel told me you've been stressed lately. Is that what she said?" He looked uncomfortable, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup. "She's been under pressure too. The pregnancy, the rent. She's scared. I'm sure she is." I said quietly, "But there are things you need to know before that fear becomes your problem for life." He frowned. "What things?" I slid an envelope across the table. Inside were a few printed screenshots. Rachel and another man, Brett Hayes, a musician from Chicago. I'd done the research. The timestamps lined up perfectly. 7 months ago, the same month Rachel conceived. Mark's face went pale. He stared at the photos, then back at me. "This doesn't mean anything." "It means enough," I said. "Brett has been sending her money, regularly." "I don't want to believe that." His voice cracked slightly. "You don't have to believe it. Just be ready." He closed the envelope, pressing his thumb against the flap, as if sealing it shut could make it untrue. "Rachel's going to say you're trying to ruin her life." "I'm not." I said, my tone flat. "She's already doing that herself." We sat in silence for a while, the hum of voices around us filling the space between words. When he finally stood, he looked older, somehow. Smaller. "I'll figure out what to do," he said, and left without finishing his drink. I stayed there for a long time, watching the rain blur the neon signs outside, listening to the faint echo of gulls near the pier. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty, just steady. That night, I returned to my apartment, dimly lit by the glow of the city. I turned on the television, plugged in the USB, and watched again, their laughter, their easy confidence. I let it play until the video ended, then rewound, and started over. I whispered to the empty room. I used to think I didn't know how to fight back. Turns out I was just waiting for the right timing. The calm in my voice startled me. It wasn't anger, it was precision. I drafted an email to my family. The subject line read, "Saturday dinner." In the message, I wrote Rachel's due soon. "Let's have dinner together. My place. 6 p.m. It was simple, polite, disarming. When I hit send, I stared at the faint reflection of myself on the laptop screen. The rain outside turned to a fine mist, the city lights soft against the window pane. I didn't smile, but my eyes did something close to it. An acknowledgement, maybe, that the performance was ready to begin. "I won't yell," I murmured the words like a vow. "I'll just let them hear themselves." The laptop went dark, leaving only the quiet pulse of the city, and the sound of rain steady and patient, waiting for what came next. Saturday came wrapped in fog, and the kind of damp chill Seattle specialized in. The street outside my building shimmered with thin rain, the air heavy with cedar and salt. Inside my apartment was warm and quiet, lit by the amber glow of the dining room lamps. The table was set perfectly. White plates, polished silver wine glasses that caught the light like tiny mirrors. I had cooked all afternoon, every motion deliberate, precise, controlled. By 6 o'clock, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. I opened the door before they could knock. My mother stood there wrapped in her favorite wool coat holding a pie box. "I brought your favorite," she said, her voice too cheerful. Behind her, my father clutched a bottle of red wine, and Rachel followed, smiling the kind of smile that only comes from rehearsing. "Baked apple?" I asked, taking the box. "You've always liked that one best." Mom's smile widened. "I remember." I stepped aside. "Come in." The warmth from the room seemed to meet the cold off their coats like two fronts colliding. The air turned still. They looked around, Rachel noting the art on the wall, Dad glancing at the ceiling as if measuring the space again. I poured wine for everyone, my hands steady. "Everything looks lovely," Olivia said, sitting down at the head of the table, as if she lived here. "You always had good taste." I smiled faintly. "I learned from the best." Dinner began with small talk. My father mentioned a client at his firm. My mother asked about my clinic, her tone pretending to care. Rachel picked at her salad, pretending to listen, her engagement ring catching the light each time she gestured. After a few minutes, she cleared her throat. "You must get lonely here, Lauren," she said, her voice light, almost playful. "All this space just for one person. It must echo at night." I sipped my wine. "Not really. Silence, and I get along." Rachel laughed too brightly. "Well, you know, with the baby coming, it's been hard to find something decent in our price range. Mark's still job hunting. We thought—" Mom jumped in smoothly. "What Rachel means is maybe you two could stay together for a little while. Family should help family, right?" Dad nodded the final punctuation. I set my glass down carefully, the sound of it meeting the wood, sharp and small. "So what you're suggesting," I said slowly, "is that I give up my home office, where I see clients, and let Rachel and Mark move in here. Temporarily." Rachel shifted. "You make it sound so harsh. I just thought it would be good for both of us." I leaned back in my chair. "You mean good for you?" The words hung in the air, heavy as the rain outside. Mom glanced at Dad, a silent exchange passing between them. Dad's voice was low, authoritative. "Lauren, your sister is about to have a child. You have more than enough room. It's not permanent." "Right," I said, my tone flat. Like it wasn't permanent when she borrowed Grandma's pearls. Mom froze. "That's ancient history." I nodded. "It is. But here's what's current." I stood, crossed the room, and pressed a button on the remote. The television flickered to life. For a second, no one understood what they were seeing. Then the image sharpened. My living room from above recorded 2 weeks earlier. My father with a tape measure. My mother opening my closet. Rachel sitting on the couch, rubbing her belly, smiling. The color drained from Mom's face. Rachel went rigid. Dad's jaw clenched. "What is this?" he said sharply. "Evidence." I replied simply. Mom stood up. "You recorded us without permission. That's illegal." I turned to her. "In Seattle, it's legal to record inside your own home. I installed cameras for security after a series of break-ins, but I didn't expect to catch my own family planning one." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. On the screen, Rachel's voice rang clear. "This place is perfect. So much better than what Mark and I can afford." Mom flinched at the sound of her own laughter in the recording. Dad's voice followed, crisp and damning. "Once she's away at that conference, we can get everything moved in. She won't say no when she gets back." The silence that followed was exquisite. Rachel slammed her fork down. "You went through all this trouble because you're jealous. You've been jealous of me since we were kids." I turned to her, my expression unreadable. "Jealous of what?" "The constant bailouts, the free passes, the way you've never had to face a single consequence of the fact that they love me." She snapped, tears starting in her eyes. I looked at my father instead. "You're a lawyer, Dad. You understand the word trespassing, right? And conspiracy." His voice rose. "That's enough. You're twisting this into something it isn't. We were helping your sister by breaking into my home." The muscles in his jaw worked. "You always overreact. Always looking for a fight." I felt my pulse steady, not rise. "You raised me to stay composed, remember? So I'm just going to state the facts." I gestured to the TV. "That's you. That's Mom. That's Rachel. That's my apartment. You entered without consent, measured walls, discussed, moving in. Everything's recorded, dated, and backed up in 3 locations. Mom sat down again, her face pale. "Lauren, honey, please. We didn't mean—" "You did." I interrupted. "You meant every word." Rachel shoved her chair back, standing abruptly. "I can't believe you'd do this to us. To your own family." I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice. "What you call family, I call entitlement." Her tears spilled over. "You're cruel." "No," I said quietly. "I'm precise." She shook her head, storming toward the door, but paused halfway. "You'll die alone in this apartment," she spat. "Maybe," I said, "but it'll still be mine." Mom made a choking sound, half sob, half disbelief. My father sat motionless, staring at the frozen image on the TV. His own face mid-sentence captured forever. I walked to the table, refilled my glass, and said softly, "Dinner's over." No one moved. The clock ticked in the background, steady and indifferent. I took a slow sip, the wine smooth against the dryness in my throat. "I didn't set out to humiliate you," I said finally, "but I wasn't about to let you rewrite the truth. Sometimes the only way to teach people boundaries is to let them hear their own voices." Rachel's sob broke the silence. Mom buried her face in her hands. Dad still hadn't looked away from the screen. I turned the TV off. The room fell into a thick, echoing quiet. "I think you should leave," I said. They did eventually, one by one. When the door closed behind them, the apartment was still again. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the blank TV screen, seeing my reflection faint and ghost-like in the dark glass. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt something sharper, cleaner, a quiet satisfaction that didn't need to be spoken. The air was tight enough to hum. My father sat rigid at the table, jaw locked, eyes sharp, with the same controlled authority he'd used my entire life. "We were just trying to help your sister," he said. His tone was the practiced calm of a man used to closing arguments, not family dinners. I leaned forward, hands resting on the table, and pressed play on my phone. His own voice filled the room, clear, confident, irrefutable. "Once she's gone, Rachel will already be here. She won't have the heart to kick out her own pregnant sister." The words cut through the silence like a wire snapping. My father's expression flickered, something between guilt and disbelief. My mother's breath hitched. Rachel's fork clattered to her plate. "You recorded us!" she shouted, tears already welling in her eyes. "You've been spying on us like some kind of psycho." "No," I said evenly. "I've been protecting what's mine." "You always want to destroy me," she screamed, pushing back her chair so hard it scraped against the floor. "Ever since we were kids, you've hated me." I met her glare, my voice calm, but sharp. "I hated what you turned me into, the quiet one who let everyone else decide what was fair." Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Every head turned. I walked over and opened it. Mark stood there, shoulders hunched, rain dripping from his jacket. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. In his hand, he held a large envelope. Rachel's voice cracked. "Mark, what are you doing here?" He stepped inside, his eyes darting from her to me. "I needed to see it for myself," he said quietly. He pulled the envelope open and slid out a sheet of paper creased from being folded too many times. "This came in this morning." Rachel froze. "What is that?" Mark's voice trembled, but he didn't look away from her. "A DNA test." Silence stretched long and unbearable. "This says he swallowed that I'm not the father." The sound that came out of Rachel wasn't human. It was half gasp, half sob. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself on the table. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not— Mark, please." He stepped back. "Don't—" Olivia's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God." My father's shoulders sagged, his authority crumbling like wet paper. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Mark said. His voice was steadier now, stripped of denial. "I had it done twice." He looked at me. "You were right." Rachel turned on me, her face blotched red. "You did this. You're the reason he doesn't trust me. I didn't make you lie," I said quietly. "You did that all by yourself." Her tears turned furious. "You've always wanted to ruin me, to take everything I have." I walked back to the table, stood beside my father. "I don't want anything you have, Rachel. That's the difference between us." My father finally looked up, eyes cold. "You'll regret this, Lauren." "Maybe," I said, "but at least I won't regret opening my eyes." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mom's sobs were the only sound sharp and rhythmic, as if she could cry loud enough to drown out the truth. Mark took a slow breath. "I'm done," he said simply. "I'll have my things out of your apartment tomorrow." Rachel reached for him. "Mark, please, we can fix this." He pulled his arm away. There's nothing to fix. You've been lying to everyone, including yourself. He turned to me, his voice softer. I'm sorry you had to be the one to expose this. I nodded once. I'm not. He left. The door shut behind him with a sound that seemed to echo through every wall. My mother sobbed harder, hands covering her face. Lauren, look what you've done. You've destroyed this family. I looked at her, then at the man who'd spent my whole life deciding who deserved compassion. I didn't destroy it, I said. I just stopped pretending it was whole. My father didn't speak again. He sat staring at the dark TV screen, the reflection of the dining room lights flickering across his face. Rachel sank back into her chair, shaking mascara streaking down her cheeks. You think you've won? She whispered. You'll be alone forever. I took a breath, slow and steady. At least it'll be honest. I picked up the remote, turned off the TV. The hum of the power down was like a sigh. They all stayed frozen, the three of them, mother weeping, father silent, sister trembling. For the first time, I felt no need to explain myself, no urge to justify what I'd done. The truth didn't require my defense. It was standing right there in the room with us, heavy and undeniable. I turned toward the hallway. The lights from the dining room stretched long behind me, casting my shadow across the floor. As I reached the doorway, I spoke quietly, almost to myself. I don't need to punish you. You've already done that. Then I walked away, leaving them in that golden, suffocating light. The sound of my mother's sobs fading behind me. My father's silence hanging like smoke, and my sister's broken voice still insisting I was the problem. The door to my bedroom closed softly. I sat on the edge of my bedshoes, still on hands shaking for the first time all night. Through the thin walls, the apartment seemed to breathe. A low hum of electricity, the faint ticking of the clock. The heartbeat of a life I'd taken back without anyone's permission. I stared at the reflection of light spilling under the door and let the quiet settle over me. They could keep their lies, their pity, their hollow apologies. All I needed was this silence. Proof that I'd finally stopped living for their approval. I exhaled once, slow and clean. The truth didn't need my voice anymore. It spoke for itself. 2 weeks after this dinner, Seattle felt colder than usual. The clouds hung low, thick as concrete, and the wind off Lake Union sliced through the city like a quiet blade. I sat in my office at Cascade Behavioral Health Coffee cooling beside me when the email came through. The subject line read, Legal Notice, Mitchell v. Mitchell. I clicked it open. My father had filed an official complaint with the Washington State Bar Association, claiming I had violated his privacy, defamed his character, and maliciously misrepresented family affairs for personal gain. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the words. A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. Of course he had. Edward Mitchell would never allow silence to be his punishment. He'd always rather burn down the house than admit he'd been wrong. I whispered to the empty office. For him, pride isn't a value. It's a religion. My phone buzzed. Emily Carter's name flashed on the screen. I answered. Already saw it, she asked, her voice brisk but steady. Just did. Don't worry. The cameras are installed in your own home. They entered without consent. You're on solid legal ground. I rubbed the bridge of my nose. He's not doing it to win M. He's doing it to save face. Let him, she said. He'll destroy what's left of it in the process. Outside, the rain started again, hard and cold. I watched it streak the windows, turning the skyline into a gray watercolor. At lunch, whispers followed me through the staff lounge. No one said my name directly, but I could feel it in the way conversations dipped when I entered. Someone had already leaked the news. By afternoon, the first headline appeared online. Prominent Seattle attorney sued by daughter over family property dispute. The article framed it as a scandal, complete with an old family photo I hadn't seen in years. My mother smiling, my father's hand on Rachel's shoulder, my own half-smile fading at the edge of the frame. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same photo they'd used for Christmas cards now illustrated their downfall. That night, I stayed late at the clinic, reviewing files, avoiding the apartment that suddenly felt like both sanctuary and crime scene. When I finally drove home, the city glowed under the streetlights slick with rain. A text from Emily waited when I walked through the door. Court hearing scheduled, Monday morning. Don't worry, I've got you. I texted back. See you there. Monday arrived gray and brittle. The courthouse smelled faintly of wet paper and old coffee. A small crowd had gathered in the hallway, half curious, half entertained. I caught sight of Ethan Miller, the journalist I'd met at the cafe weeks ago, leaning against the wall with his notepad. He gave me a small nod. Inside the courtroom felt smaller than I expected. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, sterile and sharp. My father sat at the plaintiff's table, posture impeccable, his suit a shade too dark for his complexion. My mother sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly around a tissue. Rachel wasn't there. Emily leaned toward me, whispering, "You ready?" "I've been ready for 34 years, I said quietly. The judge entered, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, and a voice that carried authority. She read the allegations aloud: privacy invasion, defamation, emotional distress. Each word was a nail in the coffin my father had built himself. Emily stood when it was her turn, calm, confident. "Your Honor." The defendant installed legally purchased security cameras within her privately owned residence. The footage in question was captured on her property during an unlawful entry by the plaintiffs who used a spare key without permission. There is no invasion of privacy when one is trespassing. My father's attorney, a junior partner from his own firm, objected, citing familial context. The judge's brow lifted. "Counselor, the law does not make exceptions for bad manners within a family." Emily clicked the remote and the footage appeared on the courtroom screen. The same scene I'd watched in my apartment, my parents measuring walls. Rachel laughing, my mother opening closets. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the projector. My mother's sob broke it. She covered her face, whispering, "Turn it off." My father sat perfectly still. His jaw clenched, his hands folded in front of him, as if sheer composure could hold back the tide. When the video ended, Emily handed over the deed to my apartment, proof of sole ownership, and a copy of the police report documenting unauthorized entry. The judge looked down from the bench. "The law is clear," she said. "Dr. Mitchell acted within her rights to secure her property. The complaint is dismissed. The court finds no grounds for defamation or invasion of privacy." For a moment, no one moved. Then Olivia slumped in her seat, her tissue falling to the floor. My father's face went pale, the kind of white that comes from shock, not age. The gavel struck once. Case closed. Outside, the air was biting the cold wind, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust. Cameras flashed as soon as we stepped into the hallway. Ethan approached, recorder in hand. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, "do you have a comment for those who say you went too far? That you were cold?" I met his eyes. "Cold isn't a crime," I said, "but taking what doesn't belong to you is." He nodded, scribbling it down. And I kept walking. By the next morning, the story had spread. Front page of the Seattle Ledger, the family that tried to steal their daughter's home. Underneath a photo of my father leaving the courthouse, his expression unreadable. By noon, word reached the legal community. Clients withdrew contracts. Colleagues distanced themselves. Within a week, Mitchell and Associates quietly removed his name from the firm's website. I read it all from my office window as snow began to fall over the city, light at first melting as soon as it touched the ground. The silence that followed wasn't victory. It was relief, deep and unfamiliar. For once, I didn't have to explain why I'd fought. They had built their own cage, and I had simply stopped opening the door. A week after the hearing, the rain had returned in earnest. Steady, cold, unrelenting. From my office window, Seattle looked like it was dissolving. The skyline was a blur of gray and silver, the streets slick with reflections of headlights and umbrellas. I held a cup of coffee in both hands, but it had long gone cold. My assistant Tessa poked her head into the doorway. "2 cancellations today," she said softly. "They said they're taking a break for a while." "Something about the media." I nodded, forcing a small smile. "It's all right, Tessa. Go ahead and reschedule them for next month." She hesitated before leaving pity in her eyes that made me want to disappear. After she was gone, I sat back and listened to the clock ticking. The article was still everywhere. Screen grabs, comment threads, the same headline looping on local news. The family that tried to steal their daughter's home. It wasn't even my words, but they were attached to me like a scar. That afternoon, I led a group therapy session. 10 chairs, 1 circle faces I'd come to know. Women rebuilding themselves after family fractures, men learning to unlearn their fathers. The topic was trust. About halfway through, a woman named Claire spoke up. She was in her 50s, hands folded tightly in her lap. I reported my father for abusing my brother when we were kids, she said. Everyone said I betrayed my family, even my mom. She died calling me ungrateful. Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. The silence after was unbearable. I looked at her and said, people who depend on silence for their power will always call truth betrayal. She met my eyes, searching for something I wasn't sure I had left. Does it ever stop hurting? I thought about my father's face in the courtroom, my mother's tears, the hollow sound of the gavel. I swallowed. It dulls, I said softly, but no, it never stops completely. When the session ended, I sat in the empty room for a long time, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from the exhaustion of holding everything together. Justice has a price. It's never free, especially when the person you're standing against shares your last name. That night, I got home to find 3 missed calls from my mother. I ignored them, set my bag down and started boiling water for tea. The phone rang again. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Her voice was rough, heavy with cigarettes and sleeplessness. You must be proud of yourself, she said. Your father's lost his firm. Nobody wants to be seen with us. My bakery's finished. I've lost everything. Are you happy now? I leaned against the counter, staring at the steam curling from the kettle. You haven't lost everything, Mom, I said quietly. You never had me to begin with. There was a sharp inhale on the other end, then a choked sob. You're cruel. No, I said. I'm just done being silent. She started to say something else, but I hung up. The phone buzzed once more, then went still. I stood there for a long time listening to the whistle of the kettle die down. The apartment was dim, except for the soft blue light from the window. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, tired, steady, unfamiliar. Tears came quiet and uncontrollable. They weren't the kind that begged for comfort. They were the kind that simply needed to exist. I wiped them with the back of my hand, took a deep breath, and walked to my desk. I opened my laptop. The folder labeled security footage blinked up at me from the screen. Dozens of files, dates, timestamps, proof. Everything that had blown my family apart. I hovered the cursor over it. My chest tightened. The folder had been my shield, my weapon, my justification. But now, it just looked like a wound I kept reopening. I right-clicked and selected delete. A box appeared. Are you sure you want to permanently delete these files? Yes. The progress bar moved slowly, each second a small act of release. When it was done, the folder was gone. I closed the laptop and exhaled. The apartment felt heavier for a moment, then lighter. When the truth has already been seen, the evidence doesn't matter anymore. I turned off the lights and sat in the middle of the living room, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the city outside. The hum of the refrigerator, the rhythm of the rain, the steady sound of my breathing. They all merged into one quiet song. The footage, the arguments, the courtroom, my mother's voice. It all receded like a tide finally pulling away from shore. I leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, palms resting on the floor. For the first time in years, there was no noise to fill the silence. No guilt, no need to explain, no desperate wish to be understood. Just the sound of rain against glass and the steady, even beat of my own heart reminding me that I'd survived it all. October mornings in Seattle always carried a kind of silence that felt deliberate, like the city was holding its breath. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when my phone rang. The building's security number flashed across the screen. Dr. Mitchell, came Thomas Rivera's calm, gravelly voice. There's someone asking to see you in the lobby. I frowned. Who? He hesitated. She says she's your sister. My stomach sank. Rachel. Yes, ma'am. She's here with a baby. I closed my eyes, exhaling through my teeth. I'll check the cameras. I opened the building's security feed. The grainy image flickered for a moment, then came into focus. Rachel standing in the lobby, cradling a small child wrapped in a pink blanket. Her hair was damp from the rain, her eyes swollen. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry that cut through the silence like glass. Thomas stood near the reception desk, maintaining distance, but keeping a careful eye. I pressed the intercom button. Rachel, I said, my voice carrying through the speakers. Her head snapped up, eyes wide, desperate. Lauren, thank God. I just need to talk to you. I swallowed hard. You can't be here. Please, she begged. Mom's sick. Really sick. She's asking for you. I felt the old instinct to soften, to fix, to rush down there and make everything okay. It rose like muscle memory, but I forced it down. Rachel, you know there's a restraining order in place. You're not allowed here. She shook her head, her voice rising. You think I care about your stupid rules? She's our mother. She needs you. I stayed quiet for a moment. You don't get to use her as a key anymore, I said finally. Her tears came harder. I have no one. Lauren, Mark's gone. Dad barely speaks to me and Mom. She's dying. What kind of person ignores their own family? My chest ached, but my voice stayed even. The kind of person who learned the hard way that family can destroy you if you let them. She glared up at the camera, eyes blazing. You think you're better than us? You think your fancy apartment and your degrees make you right? You're heartless. I didn't respond. I watched as she shifted the baby higher on her hip, whispering something to calm the child. The rain outside streaked down the glass doors behind her, washing the color out of everything. I'm calling the police, Thomas said quietly through my headset. Do it. I answered, my voice small but steady. Down in the lobby, Rachel began pacing. You're going to regret this, Lauren, she yelled, turning toward the camera. You'll be all alone one day and no one will care. Her words echoed through the speakers, sharp and familiar. It was the same tone our mother had used, the same language of guilt that had shaped every part of my childhood. I shut the intercom off. By the time the officers arrived, Rachel had sunk to the floor, the baby still crying softly in her arms. Thomas stayed close, his voice calm, measured. Ma'am, you're trespassing. You need to leave. She's my sister. Rachel snapped, clutching the child tighter. You can't keep me from her. I can, I murmured from the balcony upstairs, watching through the wide glass windows. And I have to. The officers knelt beside her, speaking gently, trying to coax her up. She resisted, then finally stood, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. Fine, she spat. But don't pretend you're the victim anymore. The doors opened with a mechanical hiss. She stepped out into the rain, the baby's wail swallowed by the wind. Thomas stayed on the phone with me as they walked her out. She's leaving now, he said quietly. You okay? I'm fine. I lied. He paused. You don't sound fine. I'll be fine, I said again and hung up. I stayed by the window long after they'd gone, watching the faint trail of headlights on the slick street below. The rain hit the glass harder, blurring the city until all I could see were shifting shapes. People think silence is cruelty. But I've learned that silence is the only wall that keeps chaos from walking through your door. That night, I went to the small cafe near Pike Place, the same one where I'd once met Ethan Miller. The air inside was warm, smelling of cinnamon and espresso. The barista recognized me and didn't ask questions. I ordered a decaf and sat by the window, letting the hum of conversation fill the quiet. Halfway through the cup, my phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. You might want to read this. He'd included a link. I clicked it. The headline glowed on my screen. When silence speaks louder than blood, I scrolled. His writing was precise, stripped of drama, but heavy with understanding. He told my story without naming me. The daughter who refused to be used, the family who mistook control for love, the courage it takes to choose peace over loyalty. I read it twice, maybe 3 times. When I reached the end, my throat tightened. The final line was simple. Sometimes the only way to heal from the ones who raised you is to stop letting them raise you anymore. The lamp above my table cast a soft gold circle across the wood, reflecting in my coffee cup. For the first time in weeks, I smiled, not out of pride, but out of recognition. Someone understood. No defending, no judging, just understanding. Outside, the rain fell harder, pounding the pavement like applause. Later, back in my apartment, I watched the building's security feed one last time before bed. The grainy black and white image showed Rachel walking away from the entrance, clutching the baby close, the hem of her coat soaked. A car passed headlights slicing across her figure before fading into the dark. The baby cried again, a high, fragile sound that echoed even through the grainy footage. Then they were gone, swallowed by the rain and the night. I turned off the monitor and stood there in the dim light, the reflection of the empty lobby shimmering across the glass. It was over, for now. But as I listened to the wind rattle the windows, I knew the price of silence wasn't peace. It was endurance, the constant act of holding your ground against the pull of guilt. And yet I'd pay it again, every time. A year slipped by, quietly measured, not in days, but in the slow, steady return of peace. One gray February morning, I sat by the kitchen window, a cup of coffee cooling beside me, and flipped through the Seattle Ledger. The city was waking up in its usual rhythm. Buses groaning down rain-slick streets, seagulls crying over Lake Union, people rushing through the fog with coffee cups and deadlines. Halfway down page 3, a small headline caught my eye. Mitchell Law Firm closes. After 32 years of operation. No photo, no drama. Just a 2-sentence notice. Due to financial and ethical complications, the firm of Edward Mitchell and Associates has formally ceased all operations. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I set the paper down, untouched coffee, rippling slightly in its cup. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumph. Only a quiet, strange stillness. I had stopped praying for them to suffer. I had simply stopped saving them. A week later, a mutual acquaintance sent me an email. My mother had sold her bakery in Queen Anne after a failed audit revealed years of unpaid taxes. She'd moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. My father had been formally disbarred for professional misconduct, something to do with falsified contracts and client kickbacks. And Rachel had been fired from her job at an insurance firm in Tacoma. They'd found discrepancies in her employee benefits file, claims she'd submitted under a fake dependent's name. A quiet civil suit followed. Karma. I thought didn't need an audience. It didn't roar. It whispered. I went back to work as usual. The clinic was steady again. The media had long since moved on to fresher scandals. My patients no longer looked at me with curiosity, just trust. One of my newer clients, a woman in her early 40s named Dana, sat across from me one afternoon. She'd been through years of emotional abuse from her family and had finally broken contact. She twisted a tissue between her fingers and asked, "Do you think justice is real, Dr. Mitchell? I mean, for people like us, who walk away instead of fight." I looked at her for a long moment. Her question wasn't about the law. It was about hope. "Yes," I said quietly. "Justice is real. But it doesn't show up when you're angry. It shows up when you stop protecting the people who hurt you." She nodded, tears glinting, and whispered, "That's hard." "It is," I said, "but peace usually costs more than chaos." After the session, I stepped outside for air. The afternoon light was soft, filtered through gray clouds, and the air smelled faintly of pine and espresso. The city pulsed beneath me, but for once, it didn't feel like it was moving faster than I could catch up. Later that week, I met with Grace Hall, my old professor from grad school, at a small cafe near the university. She was 70 now, elegant as ever, wrapped in a blue scarf and a coat that looked older than I was. We talked about work life, the state of mental health care in the country, but eventually she leaned in, eyes warm and sharp all at once. "You've lived through something most people can't name," she said. "You should write about it." I laughed softly. "Write about what the world doesn't need, another family tragedy." She smiled. "Not a tragedy. A survival story. Write so the ones who think they're crazy for setting boundaries will know they're not alone." The thought followed me home. That night I sat by the window overlooking Lake Union. The sky was clear for once, streaked in violet and gold from the dying sun. The city lights shimmered across the water. I opened my laptop, hesitated for a moment, then began to type. Invisible Daughters. That was the title that came to me first. The words felt heavy and right, like a truth waiting too long to be said. I typed the first line. "This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about release." For hours I wrote about the lies we're told as children, about loyalty being mistaken for love, about the invisible labor of being the responsible one, about the price of silence, the cost of peace, and the strange liberation of being misunderstood. Outside, the city dimmed. The reflections of the streetlights shimmered in the glass. I could hear the faint murmur of traffic on the bridge, the world going on without me needing to chase it. By the time I stopped, my coffee had gone cold again. My hands ached, but my chest felt light. I closed the laptop and looked out at the fading skyline. For the first time in years, my life wasn't defined by reaction. It was built on intention. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing. I watched as the last light of the day spilled across the window pane and thought how strange it was. That peace didn't look like victory. It looked like acceptance. The kind of acceptance that didn't erase the past, but finally mercifully stopped letting it write the future. 2 more years passed, and Seattle's winter light found its way through the tall clinic windows, soft and forgiving. The conference room smelled faintly of vanilla candles and fresh coffee. The chairs were arranged in a circle, no podiums, no barriers, just a quiet space that invited people to breathe. It was the first official meeting of the Boundaries and Healing Circle, a support group I'd founded for people learning to rebuild after family betrayal. 10 women sat with me that afternoon, all from different walks of life. Teachers, nurses, a retired librarian, a young artist. Their faces were cautious at first, but when they spoke, the air changed. A woman named Michelle went first. She was in her 50s, gray streaks in her hair, hands trembling slightly as she spoke. My mother controlled every part of my life, she said. She decided where I lived, who I married, what I studied. When I tried to move out, we told everyone I'd abandoned her. Now she calls me every day just to tell me how ungrateful I am. Her voice cracked on the last word. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the heater. Another woman, Carla nodded, wiping her eyes. My brother took our parents' house after they died, she said. Said I didn't deserve it because I never had kids. I thought about suing him, but then I thought, what's the point? I'd just be dragging myself through more poison. I watched as the pain shifted between them like an invisible current, recognition, empathy, release. I leaned forward slightly. You know, I said I used to think silence was failure, that if I didn't fight, I'd lose. But I learned that sometimes silence isn't giving up. It's the only way to stop being hurt. Heads nodded around the circle. One woman started to cry quietly, her tears rolling freely now without shame. A younger woman, maybe 30, asked softly, but what if they come back? What if my parents say they're sorry I met her eyes? I met her. Then you listen if you want to, I said. But forgiveness is a right, not an obligation. You don't owe anyone access to you just because they share your DNA. Her shoulders dropped as though she'd been holding her breath for years. That feels impossible, she whispered. It does at first, I said, but healing isn't about making them better. It's about freeing yourself from needing them to be. For a moment, the only sound was the rain tapping lightly against the windows. The tension in the room loosened like a collective exhale. Somewhere in the middle of that silence, I realized this was what I'd been building toward. Not revenge, not closure, but something else entirely. Restoration. By the end of the session, we were laughing softly through tears. Michelle offered to bring homemade cookies next time. Carla said she hadn't felt this safe in years. When the others started packing up, I stayed behind to stack the chairs. The last rays of daylight angled through the blind's dust motes swirling in the golden air. I heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up. Ethan stood at the door, a folded newspaper in his hand. He smiled when our eyes met. You weren't kidding about the lighting in this place, he said. You look like you're glowing. I laughed quietly. Maybe that's just exhaustion. He stepped closer and placed the paper on the table. The headline read, "The Women Who Healed Themselves." His name was beneath it. I ran my hand lightly over the title. You wrote this? He shrugged. Just an observation. I didn't need to embellish much. What did you write about? You, he said, smiling. Well, not just you. Women like you. People who stop waiting for apologies and start building something better. I looked down at the headline again. It's a good title. I thought so too, he said. Truth doesn't always need to expose. It can also heal. I nodded slowly. The truth knows how to take care of itself. We stood there for a moment, the sunlight pooling around our feet. He tucked his hands into his coat pockets, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself before. A quiet sense of pride, not the kind that comes from victory, but from alignment. The sense that after all the storms, I was finally standing exactly where I was meant to. As the others left, I turned back to the circle of empty chairs. The air was still warm from the bodies that had filled it, from the voices that had cracked open old pain and released it, the kind of warmth that stays even when everyone's gone. The sun slipped lower, streaking the windows in amber light. I caught my reflection faintly, smiling, soft, human again. For the first time in a long while, the light in the room didn't feel harsh. It felt earned. 2 years later, Seattle woke beneath a soft layer of fog, the kind that made the lake look like it was still dreaming. My new apartment sat just a few blocks from Lake Union, smaller than the last one, but brighter. There were no cameras this time, no hidden lenses watching from corners. I didn't need them anymore. The morning light slipped through the curtains as I poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. The air smelled of rain and roasted beans, familiar and grounding. I carried the mug to the table where my laptop-weighted screen glowing faintly in the dimness. There, at the top of my inbox, was an email from Sterling House Publishing. The subject line was short and simple, Invisible Daughters. Accepted for publication. For a long moment, I just stared at it. No surge of adrenaline, no tears, no triumphant music swelling in my head. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like balance. I clicked it open and read the message twice. My manuscript had been approved with a release date for the fall. My story, the story of surviving silence, of reclaiming boundaries, of breaking the invisible chains of family expectations, would finally be out in the world. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the fog curling outside the window. They used to say I was cold, that letting my family fall apart made me heartless. But sometimes you have to let what's toxic die so something healthy can grow in its place. The phone rang, breaking the stillness. Emily's name lit up on the screen. "Hey," she said when I answered, her voice warm with a smile I could hear. "I just saw the announcement. You did it, Lauren." I laughed softly. "No, we did it. You were the one who told me to keep writing." "Remember, I told you to stop apologizing," she said. "The writing part was all you." I looked at the manuscript still open on my desktop, a document that had started as therapy and turned into testimony. "It doesn't feel like a victory," I said. "It's not supposed to," she replied. "It's peace. There's a difference." We stayed on the line for another minute, not saying much, both knowing that silence didn't mean distance anymore. When the call ended, I set the phone down and walked to the balcony. The city was slowly waking up beneath the soft haze. Ferries moved across the lake, leaving silver trails in their wake. A jogger passed below, headphones and scarf pulled high. Somewhere a wind chime rang faintly. I took a deep breath, the air cool and wet against my skin. For the first time in years, I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel like I had to prove anything to anyone. Behind me, the faint reflection of my old security camera sat on a shelf by the wall, unplugged dust gathering along the edges. A relic from a version of myself that needed proof to believe what she already knew. I turned back to the view, watching as sunlight began to pierce the fog. The city shimmered faintly, a promise more than a place. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't mind. I went back inside, closed the laptop, and sat for a while, with the sound of the city breathing through the open balcony door. I whispered to the room. "I don't need recordings anymore. The truth lives in me now." It wasn't defiance, it was peace. A simple statement of existence. I stood, took one last sip of coffee, and set the mug on the counter. Then I reached for my coat, turned off the lights, and let the soft, gray daylight fill the space. Before leaving, my eyes lingered on the old camera one last time. It sat there like a memory, silent, harmless. No longer a weapon or a shield. Just an object that once served its purpose. I smiled faintly. "We're both retired now," I said under my breath. Then I opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and walked toward the elevator. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. The sun reached across the lake, scattering gold across the rippling surface. The air smelled clean new. As I crossed the street, I thought of the people who might someday read my book. Women sitting in parked cars holding their breath after a fight. Daughters who'd stopped answering calls. Sons who'd been told they were ungrateful for wanting peace. If they read it, I wanted them to know one thing. Silence isn't weakness. It's survival. And survival can be its own kind of voice. So if you've ever been hurt by the people who were supposed to love you most, remember this. Silence has a language of its own. And one day, when you're ready, you'll learn how to speak it for yourself. I kept walking, letting the morning swallow me whole, the sound of gulls echoing over the water. The truth no longer needed proof. It was simply alive, steady, unrecorded, and free.